So the other day I was in a group chat and we are trying to get all the numbers and the names figured out. And at one point someone asked what number, like who is my number? And I said, it's me. And they said, are you sure? And, it was a funny moment, but being the, overthinker that I am, it really got me thinking about who I am and if I am being who I am, and a lot of just about my personal identity and about, the perception of the self and other people's perceptions of me and just who I truly am. Calling back to my idea from the first episode I made, I think the way this question is worded kind of sets us up for failure already, because it's assuming that there's an answer to who am I. But I'd like to first reference my personal favorite philosopher, Soren Kierkegaard. So in his book, The Sickness Unto Death, written in 1849, he says, the self is a relation that relates itself to itself. Now, what a sentence. But what he means by this is who we are is, there's no answer, but the answer is the question, and it's a lifelong question that we're constantly asking ourselves. He goes on to say that identity and who you are is not just a static thing, but it's a constant state of becoming, of moving towards who you are. That it's a long life, active, continual choice of you choosing what kind of person you want to be. Now, Kierkegaard really emphasizes how important it is that we ask ourselves this question. In his book, The Present Age, written in 1846, he describes how society has kind of dissolved our need to answer this question by sort of, assimilating the individual into the public, and how, you can see it nowadays. If you go on Instagram, how many people, define themselves going for a certain aesthetic, going for a certain vibe that they, are basing on the world around them. And, there's nothing wrong with changing who you want to be and, trying to dress a certain way, trying to act a certain way, in if it's done in the light of self-improvement. But if it's done in a way where you're just trying to conform to please that society, Kierkegaard would say that you're almost wearing masks that are being handed to you. And he goes in his book Either Or, he actually has a whole chapter called The Unhappiest One. And he says that people that are stuck in this state of despair where they're failing to find out who they truly are, either by refusing responsibility or by losing themselves in these masks and social roles that he describes, that people that are too afraid of, too upset about their past, too afraid of the future, and are just confining themselves are, the worst, unhappiest kind of people. And, later as he becomes more theological in his writing, he describes how we need to be actively becoming, the people through God that God wants us to be. The main focus here for Kierkegaard isn't, what kind of person we ought to be. And as we're asking that question, like his personal favorite and hero, Socrates, where he outlines these, virtues, and that we should be just and courageous and knowledgeable. For Kierkegaard, his main goal he's trying to accomplish and promote people to do is that you need to be asking yourself. That's what's important to him, not the person itself but more the process of becoming. In his book Either Or, it's split into two parts. The first, he describes the aesthetic person, and that's also the part where that chapter, The Unhappiest One, is. And he describes about how people often are just living purely through emotion, and it causes a lot of regret, and they're not so much unsure of who they are, because like he said, it's a transient thing. It's a question without answer. We should be unsure, but that these people are not asking the question. And he, in other works, he describes as he thinks about why this might be, and he talks a lot about, you know, this agony of abundance and this lack of lack, and um he talks about things about how anxieties are motivators and stuff. But in either or, the second part he talks about is the ethical person, and that's the person that is actively searching for who they want to be and actively asking the question throughout their whole life. He's not really, you know, giving you a set of rules to follow and, you know, do this, do that, don't do this. He's saying, he's giving you, you know, the kind of life you should be living, where you're committed to yourself and your goals and, you know, whatever your goals may be. He's not telling you what you should be doing. You should be forming a stable character. You should be figuring out who you are, who you want to be, and you should be actively acting with the intention of being that person, of becoming that person. He, being a Christian, of course, says that we should be working towards, you know, the people God wants us to be, you know, more pious, more in his image. And that's his big motivation for why we should be doing this, is because we need to be the people God want us to be, who God intended us to be. But for, you know, non-religious people as well, I think you can still take a lot of these lessons where you should be oriented towards truth and figuring it out rather than performing or your appearance in the society, like he talked about, where it gives you these masks, where you should be, regardless of religion, you need to be oriented and working towards yourself. Now, if we are often living just with a series of masks, that begs the question of what's underneath that. Is there a sort of, you know, a deep down, as people say? There's a quote from BoJack Horseman, actually, I like, where it's BoJack and he's talking to Diane, and he says, underneath all that, deep down, I'm a good person, and I need you to tell me that I'm good. And then Diane, you know, later responds, she says, you know, that's the thing I don't think I believe in deep down. I kind of think all you are is just the things you do. Looping back to the Kierkegaard, that's why he's saying we need to be actively acting towards the kind of people we want to be, because, you know, it doesn't matter if deep down we want to be one way. If we're not acting it and we're not showing it, then we're not that way. Now, for this deep down, we kind of talked about Kierkegaard, where he says there is this sort of deep down, but we have to be choosing it, and we have to be searching for it and finding it, and not finding it in the sense where it already exists, but like we have to be deciding it and choosing it. And then we briefly touched on Socrates. His idea on this is that he says that there is a deep down self, that we have a rational soul, and that, you know, the world around us and the physical world changes, but our soul and our virtue is what we need to hold true. And that he says, yeah, that there's a way we ought to be, and there's a right and wrong, and we have that deep down soul. But another school of thought is a more Buddhist, actually, sense, but it also, David Hume talks a lot about it as well. Now, Hume, in his book A Treatise of Human Nature, written in 1739, says that the self is nothing but a bundle of perceptions, and that there's not, contrary to what Socrates says and what Kierkegaard says, there's not an obtainable self that either is, like Socrates said, something that is just there and transcendent and metaphysical, or is something, like Kierkegaard says, that we actively choose to obtain. he says that it's a sort of fiction that we create to tie just all our experiences and memories together, and all our perceptions of ourselves, and we perceive other people's perceptions of ourselves as well. And he says almost that these are all sort of disconnected experiences, and that at any given moment we're just acting out of just nature, and it's just we just act naturally, and there's not really something tying us together of who we are. And that we can form habits, sure, but it's ever changing, and it doesn't mean that that's the kind of people we are. So as he's talking about all these unstable things of, our body, our minds, our perceptions, the world around us that's just constantly changing, he even goes so far to say that this craving for a true sense of self, and for a permanence in, an impermanent world, is actually kind of like a root of all our suffering. And that's where it really ties in to the Buddhist view, where the self is just a process of how we move through the world, the idea of self, and that this want and this need we have to be a certain way is what's actually causing, is the root of all suffering. I also think it ties in a lot with, Taoism, and sort of just going with the flow and following the way. Now, jumping off of Hume's idea of we're just a perception of, like a combination of perceptions and memories, um, Locke actually talks about in his essay called Concerning Human Understanding, written in 1690, where he says that personal identity is sort of just a continuation of memory. And he kind of, the way I like to think about it is, if you lost all memory, who could tell you who you are? And he almost says that, yeah, the who we are is just, it becomes an external thing of other people's stories about you, photos of you, documents, especially nowadays where so much of our lives from birth is documented on paper. That who we are is, defined by the world around us, not the self. Now, another way to approach this question, the very start of the question of who are you, is from a very, metaphysical, weird sense of, well, first off, what am I? Am I my brain? Am I my soul? Am I my consciousness? Am I my ego? And how are all these things connected? But truthfully, I am not well versed enough yet to fully dive into that, but I'll revisit it later. Lastly, I'd like to just give, my own personal thoughts on this question, and my advice to anyone that's struggling with this question, and is, having any sort of stress about not knowing what kind of person they are. I think I agree and largely with Kierkegaard, where I think that you can wake up and to a certain extent decide what kind of person you want to be, and you need act through that way, and you live trying to reach that goal, and that's who you are. Is your who you are is defined by your ability to become who you want to be. I think I would recommend anyone to really start, like, lay out what's important to them. They're not too many, just like their core values of what kind of person they want to be. For me, I'd probably put like authenticity up there, and just lay out things that are important to you and that you want to embody, and you want other people to look at you and know that, be able to tell that that's what you are. And you're not doing it for them, though. You're not trying to live and be those things for them. You're doing it for you, but in doing that, you need to be exemplifying them so much that other people can tell, because part of who you are is how you are perceived. Yeah, these are just some teachings for you, some thoughts from other people, some of my own personal thoughts. I mean, yeah, I'm really just trying to encourage people to ask these questions. As always, let me know, if you have anything to say in the comments. There were some pretty funny ones on the last video. Yeah. God bless.
Thanks for watching. Thanks.